The tension in the packed congressional hearing room was already thick when Kari Lake stood up from her chair, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Get out!" she yelled at Jasmine Crockett, pointing directly at the Texas congresswoman. "You have no business being here." What happened next left everyone in the room completely stunned. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Instead, she delivered a response so sharp, so perfectly calculated, that it would dominate headlines for weeks and leave America talking about this moment for months to come. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was the moment when two powerful women from opposite sides of the political spectrum collided in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. And what Crockett said next would completely flip the script on Lake in a way nobody saw coming. The cameras were rolling. Social media was watching, and America was about to witness one of the most explosive political confrontations of the year. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The stage was set for political theater at its finest, but nobody could have predicted just how dramatically this would unfold. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two women are and what brought them to this moment. Kari Lake had built her reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight. The former television news anchor turned political powerhouse had spent years in Arizona politics, earning a following for her direct, no-nonsense approach. At 54, Lake had developed a reputation for speaking her mind, regardless of who might be offended. Lake's background in media gave her a unique advantage in political battles. She knew exactly how to command a room, how to use her voice as a weapon, and how to make sure the cameras captured every dramatic moment. Her supporters loved her for what they called her authentic approach to politics, while her critics often accused her of being too aggressive and confrontational. But Lake didn't care about the criticism. She had built her entire political brand around being the person willing to say what others wouldn't. Her motto was simple: fight for what you believe in, no matter the cost. On the other side of this confrontation stood Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas, who had quickly made a name for herself since arriving in Washington. A former public defender and civil rights attorney, Crockett had built her career on standing up to bullies and fighting for the underdog. Crockett's legal background had taught her something invaluable: how to stay calm under pressure and how to use facts as weapons. She was known for her quick wit, her ability to think on her feet, and her talent for turning an opponent's aggression against them. Unlike many politicians who tried to avoid confrontation, Crockett seemed to thrive in heated moments. Her colleagues often said she had a special gift for making opponents lose their composure while she remained perfectly calm and collected. This confrontation wasn't happening in a vacuum. The hearing room was packed with media, political observers, and members of both parties who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The political climate had been building toward this kind of explosive encounter for months. Lake represented the new wave of aggressive conservative politics, while Crockett embodied the emerging generation of Democratic leaders who refused to be intimidated. This was more than just two politicians disagreeing. This was a clash between two completely different visions of how politics should work in America. The room buzzed with anticipation as both women took their positions. Reporters had their phones ready, knowing that whatever happened next would likely go viral within minutes. Political staffers whispered nervously, understanding that moments like these could make or break careers. What nobody realized was that Crockett had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation for weeks. She had studied Lake's tactics, watched her previous encounters, and developed a strategy that would completely catch the Arizona politician off guard. The hearing had started normally enough, with routine questions and predictable political posturing from both sides. But tension had been building throughout the morning as Lake grew increasingly frustrated with what she saw as Democratic grandstanding. It started with small comments and pointed looks. Lake had been making notes furiously as Democratic members asked their questions, occasionally shaking her head in visible disapproval. Crockett, for her part, had been watching Lake carefully, noting every reaction and filing away information for later use. The first real spark came when Lake interrupted another speaker to make a point of order. "This is ridiculous," she declared, her voice rising above the normal hearing room volume. "We're wasting everyone's time with these partisan attacks instead of focusing on real issues that matter to the American people." Several Democratic members exchanged glances, but Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression neutral. She was watching Lake like a chess player studying her opponent's moves, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the morning progressed, Lake's frustration became more visible. She began making more frequent interruptions, her voice growing sharper with each comment. "This is exactly what's wrong with Washington," she declared during one particularly heated exchange. "We have people here who are more interested in scoring political points than actually solving problems." The comment was clearly directed at the Democratic side of the room, and specifically at Crockett, who had been asking detailed questions about policy implementation. But instead of responding immediately, Crockett simply smiled slightly and continued with her line of questioning. This only seemed to irritate Lake more. She began tapping her pen loudly on the table, shifting in her chair, and making increasingly dramatic facial expressions whenever Crockett spoke. The cameras caught every reaction, and political observers in the room began to sense that something bigger was brewing. The turning point came when Crockett began asking a series of pointed questions about a controversial policy proposal that Lake had publicly supported. Crockett's questions were methodical, precise, and designed to highlight potential problems with Lake's position. "Can you explain to the American people," Crockett asked in her calm, measured tone, "how this policy would actually help working families when the data shows it would primarily benefit wealthy corporations?" Lake's face flushed red. "That's a completely unfair characterization," she shot back, her voice rising noticeably. "You're twisting the facts to fit your narrative just like always." "I'm simply asking about the data," Crockett replied evenly. "These are numbers from independent economic analysis, not political talking points." The room fell silent as everyone sensed the confrontation escalating. Lake gripped her microphone tighter, her knuckles whitening as she struggled to maintain her composure. What happened next was a masterclass in political pressure tactics. Crockett began a systematic deconstruction of Lake's policy positions, using facts, figures, and Lake's own previous statements to build her case. Each question was more pointed than the last, each challenge more difficult to answer. "2 weeks ago, you said this policy would create jobs," Crockett continued, pulling out a printed quote. "But yesterday, a major employer in your own state announced layoffs directly related to similar policies. How do you reconcile that contradiction?" Lake was visibly struggling now. Her media training had prepared her for hostile interviews, but this was different. Crockett wasn't attacking her personally. She was systematically dismantling her arguments using Lake's own words and public record. "You're taking things out of context," Lake protested, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "These are complex issues that can't be reduced to simple sound bites." "I agree they're complex," Crockett replied smoothly. "That's why I'm asking for detailed explanations rather than sound bites. Can you walk us through the specific mechanisms by which this policy achieves its stated goals?" By this point, Lake was clearly rattled. Her usual confident demeanor had cracked, and she was making increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative. She began speaking faster, her voice getting higher, and her arguments becoming less coherent. "This is exactly the kind of gotcha politics that Americans are sick of," Lake declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Crockett. "You're not interested in real solutions. You're just trying to score cheap political points for your base." But Crockett remained unmoved. "I'm interested in understanding how policies affect real people," she replied calmly. "These aren't gotcha questions. They're the kind of questions any responsible legislator should be able to answer." The contrast was striking. Lake was becoming more agitated by the minute, while Crockett remained perfectly composed. The cameras captured every moment of Lake's growing frustration and Crockett's steady confidence. Just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, an unexpected interruption threatened to derail Crockett's carefully planned strategy. A technical issue with the microphone system caused a brief delay, giving Lake a moment to compose herself and regroup. During the break, Lake's staff could be seen whispering urgently in her ear, clearly trying to help her develop a new approach. Lake took several deep breaths and seemed to regain some of her composure. When the session resumed, Lake appeared ready for a fresh start. But Crockett had anticipated this possibility and was prepared with an even more devastating line of questioning. As the hearing moved toward its climax, Crockett began to focus on Lake's most vulnerable position, a policy stance that had been widely criticized by experts across the political spectrum. She had saved this for last, knowing it would be the most difficult for Lake to defend. "Let's talk about your position on healthcare policy," Crockett began, her tone still perfectly calm, but with a slight edge that suggested she was moving in for the kill. "You've publicly stated that market-based solutions will automatically reduce costs for families, but we have decades of data showing that hasn't worked. What evidence do you have that this time will be different?" Lake's face went pale. This was the one area where she knew her position was weakest, and Crockett had just put her finger directly on the problem. The room held its breath as everyone waited to see how Lake would respond, and that's when Lake completely lost her composure and delivered the line that would define this entire confrontation. Lake stood up so suddenly that her chair rolled backward, hitting the wall behind her with a loud crash. Her face was bright red, her hands were shaking, and when she spoke, her voice echoed through the suddenly silent hearing room. "Get out!" she yelled, pointing directly at Crockett with a trembling finger. "You have no business being here. You're nothing but a partisan hack who's trying to destroy everything good about this country." The room erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery, reporters frantically typed on their phones, and camera operators zoomed in to capture every detail of Lake's meltdown. Several other members tried to restore order, but Lake wasn't finished. "I'm sick of listening to your lies and your twisted version of reality," Lake continued, her voice getting even louder. "You don't represent real Americans. You represent the radical left agenda that's trying to tear down our values and our way of life." For a moment, the room was frozen in shock. Nobody had expected Lake to completely lose control like this. But all eyes quickly turned to Crockett to see how she would respond to this unprecedented outburst. Crockett didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, looked directly at Lake with a slight smile, and delivered a response that would instantly become legendary. "Ms. Lake," she said in a tone so calm it was almost conversational, "I understand you're frustrated, but I need to point out something important. You just told me to get out of a congressional hearing room where I was elected to serve by the people of Texas. The same people, by the way, who rejected your bid for office." The room went dead silent. The impact of Crockett's words hit like a physical blow. Lake's mouth fell open as she realized what had just happened. But Crockett wasn't done. "You see, Ms. Lake, there's a fundamental difference between us," Crockett continued, her voice still perfectly controlled. "I was elected to be here. The voters chose me to represent them in this chamber. You, on the other hand, were rejected by the voters when you ran for office. So when you tell me to get out, you're essentially telling the voters who sent me here that their choice doesn't matter." Lake tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up a hand and continued. "But let's talk about what just happened here. You were asked legitimate policy questions, the kind any elected official should be able to answer. Instead of providing answers, you had what can only be described as a public meltdown. You resorted to personal attacks and conspiracy theories instead of addressing the substantive issues that affect millions of Americans." The gallery was completely silent, hanging on every word. Even Lake's supporters seemed stunned by the turn of events. Crockett had managed to flip the entire dynamic of the confrontation in less than 2 minutes. Democratic members were trying to hide their smiles, while Republicans looked uncomfortable and unsure how to respond. The media representatives were frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a defining political moment. "Ms. Lake, you just proved something very important," Crockett said, finally standing up but maintaining her calm demeanor. "You proved that when challenged on the substance of your positions, when asked to defend your ideas with facts and evidence, you can't do it. Instead, you attack the person asking the questions." She turned to address the entire room, not just Lake. "This is exactly what's wrong with our political discourse today. We have people who are more interested in performing outrage than in governing, more interested in viral moments than in viable solutions, more interested in attacking their opponents than in addressing the real challenges facing American families." Lake tried desperately to recover from her outburst. "That's not what I meant," she said, her voice much quieter now but still shaking. "I'm just frustrated with the partisan games and the unfair attacks." But it was too late. Crockett had already seized control of the narrative, and she wasn't about to let Lake off the hook. "Unfair attacks?" Crockett repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I asked you about your policy positions using your own public statements and independently verified data. If you consider that an unfair attack, then I think we've identified part of the problem." Crockett then did something that nobody expected. She pulled out a folder that had been sitting on the table in front of her throughout the entire hearing. "Ms. Lake, since you seem to have trouble answering questions about your policy positions, let me help you out," she said, opening the folder. "This contains transcripts of 17 different interviews where you've taken contradictory positions on the same issues we discussed today." Lake's face went white. She clearly had no idea that Crockett had done this level of research. "For example," Crockett continued, pulling out a specific document. "3 months ago, you said healthcare costs were primarily driven by government regulation. 2 weeks ago, you blamed pharmaceutical companies. Last week, you said it was insurance companies. Today, you couldn't explain any of your positions when asked for specifics." The room was completely silent as Crockett methodically laid out her case. "This isn't about partisan politics, Ms. Lake. This is about accountability. The American people deserve leaders who can explain their positions, defend their ideas, and engage in substantive policy discussions. What they got from you today was a temper tantrum." Crockett then delivered the line that would be replayed on news programs for weeks to come. "Ms. Lake, you told me to get out. But I think what really needs to get out is this idea that political leaders can avoid accountability by throwing fits when they're challenged. The American people are too smart for that, and they deserve better." She closed the folder and sat back down, her expression calm and confident. "Now, if you're ready to have a real policy discussion based on facts rather than outrage, I'm happy to continue. But if you're going to keep throwing tantrums every time someone asks you a substantive question, then maybe you should consider whether you're really cut out for public service." The silence that followed was deafening. Lake stood there for a moment, seemingly unsure what to do next. Her face cycled through several different expressions: anger, embarrassment, confusion, and finally something that looked like defeat. She slowly sat back down, but she didn't say another word for the rest of the hearing. The fight had gone out of her completely. Crockett had not only defended herself against Lake's attack, but had turned it into a comprehensive demolition of Lake's entire approach to politics. The other members of the committee seemed to recognize that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Several Democratic members were openly smiling now, while Republicans looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The media representatives were already composing their headlines, knowing that this confrontation would dominate the news cycle for days to come. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, video clips of the exchange began flooding social media platforms. The hashtag #DashaGetOutGate started trending almost immediately, followed quickly by Crockett destroyed Lake and Lake meltdown. The contrast between the two women's behavior was stark and unavoidable. Every major clip showed Lake's angry outburst, followed immediately by Crockett's calm, measured response. The visual was devastating for Lake and transformative for Crockett. Political commentators across the spectrum were quick to weigh in, Even some conservative voices had to admit that Lake had handled the situation poorly. She walked right into, "That one," tweeted one prominent conservative analyst. "You can't lose your temper like that and expect to win the argument." Meanwhile, Democratic supporters were sharing the clips with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully," and "Crockett just gave a masterclass in staying calm under pressure." The original video of the confrontation was viewed over 2 million times in the first 6 hours after it was posted. By the end of the first day, various clips and commentary videos had accumulated more than 15 million total views across all platforms. The engagement was overwhelmingly positive for Crockett and negative for Lake. Analysis of the comments showed that even many people who typically supported conservative positions were critical of Lake's behavior, while praising Crockett for maintaining her composure. News organizations that tracked social media sentiment found that Lake's outburst was being compared to previous political meltdowns by figures who had damaged their careers with similar displays of uncontrolled anger. The confrontation had immediate implications for both women's political futures. For Crockett, it represented a breakthrough moment that established her as a major player on the national political stage. Democratic leadership took notice of her performance, and she began receiving invitations to appear on major news programs and at high-profile political events. Political strategists noted that Crockett had demonstrated exactly the kind of skills that Democratic voters were looking for in their leaders: the ability to stay calm under pressure, the preparation to back up arguments with facts, and the communication skills to explain complex issues in ways that ordinary people could understand. For Lake, the implications were much more serious. The outburst raised questions about her temperament and her ability to handle the pressures of high-level political office. Even some of her supporters began to express concerns about whether she was ready for the kind of intense scrutiny that comes with national political leadership. Political analysts across the spectrum were unanimous in their assessment that Crockett had won the confrontation decisively. But many went beyond simply declaring a winner to analyze what the exchange revealed about the current state of American politics. "This was a perfect example of the difference between substance and spectacle," wrote one prominent political journalist. "Lake came prepared for a performance, while Crockett came prepared for a policy discussion. When forced to choose between the two approaches, voters consistently prefer substance." Communications experts praised Crockett's technique, noting how she had remained calm while systematically dismantling her opponent's arguments. "She turned Lake's aggression into a weakness," observed one former political consultant. "By staying composed while Lake lost control, she made Lake look unprofessional and unprepared." In the days following the confrontation, more details emerged about the preparation that had gone into Crockett's performance. Her staff revealed that she had spent weeks studying Lake's previous public appearances, identifying patterns in her arguments, and preparing responses to likely attacks. The folder that Crockett had produced during the hearing contained not just the documents she had mentioned, but a comprehensive analysis of Lake's public positions going back several years. Her team had identified numerous contradictions and inconsistencies that could be used to challenge Lake's credibility. "Representative Crockett believes in being prepared," said one of her senior staffers. She knew that if she was going to challenge someone like Lake, she needed to have all her facts in order and be ready for any kind of response. This level of preparation stood in stark contrast to Lake's approach, which seemed to rely primarily on passion and performance, rather than detailed policy knowledge. Political communication professors began analyzing the exchange frame by frame, noting how Crockett had employed advanced rhetorical techniques that most politicians never master. Her use of what experts call reflective questioning, turning Lake's accusations back on herself, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of debate tactics. When Lake accused her of partisan games, Crockett immediately asked what was partisan about citing Lake's own statements, explained one professor of political science. This forced Lake to either defend contradictory positions or admit she had been inconsistent. It's a classic legal technique that works brilliantly in political confrontations. The timing of Crockett's responses was also noteworthy. She allowed strategic pauses after her most devastating points, giving the audience time to absorb the impact of her words. These silences, which might seem like dead air in normal conversation, created dramatic tension that made her arguments even more powerful. The rapid spread of the confrontation videos revealed something important about how modern political moments gain traction online. Social media platforms' algorithms seem to favor the dramatic visual contrast between Lake's outburst and Crockett's composed response, pushing the clips to millions of users who might not normally engage with political content. Technology analysts noted that the confrontation had all the elements that social media algorithms prioritize: strong emotional reactions, clear visual contrasts, and high engagement rates. Within hours, the clips were being shared not just by political partisans, but by users who were drawn to the pure drama of the moment. The algorithm doesn't care about political ideology, explained one social media researcher. It cares about engagement, and this confrontation generated exactly the kind of emotional response that keeps people watching and sharing. Lake's outburst was algorithmically perfect content for her opponent. This algorithmic amplification meant that Lake's worst moment reached far more people than it might have in previous eras of political communication. The same technology that could help politicians reach voters more effectively also meant that political failures could be broadcast to unprecedented audiences. Political training organizations quickly incorporated the Lake-Crockett exchange into their curriculum for aspiring politicians. The confrontation became a case study in both what to do and what not to do when facing aggressive questioning. Democratic training programs used Crockett's performance as an example of effective preparation and composure under pressure. They analyzed her technique of staying calm, using specific evidence, and turning attacks into opportunities to highlight policy differences. Republican training programs, meanwhile, used Lake's outburst as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining professionalism even when frustrated. Conservative political consultants emphasized that while passion could be an asset, losing control was always politically damaging. The confrontation also influenced media training programs for corporate executives and other public figures. Communications coaches began using the exchange to teach clients about the importance of preparation and emotional regulation in high-pressure situations. The confrontation sparked a broader national conversation about the state of political discourse in America. Many commentators noted that while political disagreements were inevitable and even healthy, the way those disagreements were conducted mattered enormously. What we saw in this exchange was the difference between someone who came prepared to govern and someone who came prepared to perform, wrote one editorial writer. The American people deserve leaders who can do both. But when forced to choose, they consistently prefer competence over charisma. Educational institutions began using the exchange as a case study in political communication classes, highlighting both what to do and what not to do in high-pressure political situations. 4. Jasmine Crockett. The confrontation marked the beginning of a new phase in her political career. She was invited to speak at major Democratic events, appeared on national news programs, and was mentioned as a potential candidate for higher office. Her fundraising numbers increased dramatically in the weeks following the confrontation, as Democratic donors across the country sought to support someone who had demonstrated the ability to effectively counter aggressive conservative tactics. Crockett used her increased profile to advocate for the policy positions she had been discussing. During the original hearing, turning her moment of political triumph into a platform for substantive policy advocacy. For Kari Lake, the aftermath was much more challenging. The outburst became a defining moment that overshadowed many of her other political activities. Even supporters began to question whether she had the temperament necessary for high-level political leadership. Political communication experts identified several key lessons from the exchange. First, preparation matters more than passion. Crockett's detailed knowledge of the issues and her opponent's positions allowed her to control the conversation even when under attack. Second, maintaining composure under pressure is crucial. By staying calm while Lake became increasingly agitated, Crockett made herself look professional while making Lake look unprepared. Third, facts are more powerful than feelings in political arguments. Crockett's use of specific data and Lake's own previous statements gave her credibility that Lake's emotional appeals couldn't match. Fourth, knowing when to strike is as important as knowing how to strike. Crockett waited for the right moment to deploy her most devastating arguments, maximizing their impact. The confrontation occurred during a period when American voters were expressing frustration with political leaders who seemed more interested in fighting than in governing. Polls consistently showed that voters wanted their representatives to focus on solving problems rather than creating drama. In this context, Crockett's performance resonated with voters who were tired of political theater and wanted to see their leaders engage in substantive policy discussions. Her ability to turn Lake's attack into a discussion about the importance of policy expertise struck a chord with many Americans. The exchange also highlighted the changing nature of political media, where individual moments could be instantly shared and analyzed by millions of people. Both politicians had to adapt to an environment where every word and gesture could become part of a viral video within minutes. Political strategists predicted that the Lake-Crockett confrontation would influence how politicians prepared for future public appearances. The importance of being ready to defend policy positions with specific facts and data became even more apparent after Lake's inability to do so had such devastating consequences. The exchange also suggested that voters were becoming more sophisticated in their ability to distinguish between substance and spectacle in political communications. Crockett's fact-based approach had clearly resonated more than Lake's emotional appeals. As the political landscape continued to evolve, the confrontation served as a reminder that, in an age of instant communication and viral videos, a single moment of poor judgment could have lasting consequences for a political career. Months after the confrontation, political observers were still referring to the Lake-Crockett moment as an example of effective political communication. Crockett's approach had become a model for other Democratic politicians, while Lake's outburst served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing composure in high-pressure situations. The exchange demonstrated that in modern American politics, the ability to stay calm under pressure, master complex policy details, and communicate effectively with the public had become more important than ever before. As both women continued their political careers, the confrontation remained a defining moment that illustrated the power of preparation, the importance of composure, and the enduring appeal of substance over spectacle in American political discourse. The confrontation between Kari Lake and Jasmine Crockett lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact continues to reverberate through American politics. It demonstrated the power of preparation over passion, the importance of facts over feelings, and the effectiveness of calm competence over angry performance. For viewers who witnessed the exchange, it served as a reminder that in a democracy, the quality of political discourse matters enormously. The way leaders handle disagreement, respond to pressure, and communicate with the public shapes not just their own careers, but the health of democratic institutions themselves. The lesson was clear. In American politics, those who come prepared to govern will always have an advantage over those who only come prepared to perform. Thanks for watching this incredible political moment unfold. If you enjoyed this analysis of one of the most dramatic confrontations in recent political history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll continue to bring you the most important political moments and help you understand what they really mean for America's future. The next time politicians clash like this, you'll want to be ready to see how it all unfolds.